Hello, everybody. Today we're looking at our 2 Corinthians 13 lesson, and I'd like to give maybe just 3 ideas that I think would help your preparation and also your classes. You'll notice that our objective is to help students overcome the temptation to criticize others, specifically church leaders, to examine our faithfulness in that regard. As I reviewed this lesson, I could see how easy it would be to get to the end of the lesson and for students to feel like today the lesson was about not criticizing our church leaders. That's a good subject. That's an important thing to talk about. But it made me think about in our Teaching the Savior's Way manual, we're invited to teach about Jesus Christ no matter what we are teaching. And so we've got to make sure that every time we step into the classroom, we're pointing to the Savior. We have this line, no matter what you're teaching, remember that we're really teaching about Jesus Christ and how to become like him. So I think that's my tip number 1 for that is remember what we're trying to do here. And so as we start, we're talking about examples of how people might be critical of church leaders, the difference between having honest questions and concerns or being critical. And then we have, why is it important to overcome the temptation to criticize others, including church leaders? I thought it could be helpful. I like the idea of early on in the lesson pointing to faith in Jesus Christ, maybe asking this kind of question over here. How does our attitude toward our leaders relate to exercising faith in Jesus Christ? So in other words, we're trying to frame all of this talk about criticizing church leaders, attaching it to faith in Jesus Christ. I think that's a big question and could get a lot of mileage out of it. In fact, I might recommend asking that question here at the beginning of the lesson, and then when we end, asking the same question. So how did what we talked about today, how does that relate to increasing our faith in the Savior? And so when students go home, they realize that we did talk about criticizing church leaders, but it was in the context of that connection to Jesus Christ. So that's tip number 1. Second tip is, as we're getting into the epistles of Paul, you'll notice that a lot of the verses we're looking for things, and you can find things in the verses, but sometimes they're kind of cryptic because the writings of Paul aren't always super easy to read. For example, as we're talking about some of the saints in Corinth were publicly critical of Paul, and you have some references there. We're inviting students to find and mark, that's my reminder or plug for that again, find and mark in 2 Corinthians 13:3 what some church members in Corinth were seeking proof of from Paul. And so if we were to actually go to that verse, you can see, since ye seek a proof of Christ speaking in me, which to you word is not weak but is mighty in you, that's kind of a difficult verse for not only our students, but for us as teachers. And so I like the idea often, and I think we could do this quite a bit, of saying, let's rewrite this in our own words. So in your journal, would you try to rewrite, what is Paul really saying? And work with them what these phrases might mean. And so another option is to say it in your own words. Okay, that's how Paul wrote it. If he were to write verse 3 today, how would he say it? And so we're just trying to find greater clarity in the verses. I think the assumption that it all makes sense probably isn't accurate. And so go slow on these verses. Almost anytime there's a verse, we could do some rewriting. For his letters that say they are weighty and powerful, but his bodily presence is weak and his speech contemptible. That's beautiful writing. But my guess is only a small portion of our students at the first reading would even have a sense of what Paul's talking about. So have fun with rewriting or say it in your own words. I think we can do that activity a lot in the epistles. That is tip number 2. Tip number 3 goes like this. As we scroll down here, there's an activity where we're going to look at scriptural accounts that illustrate the difference between exercising faith and being critical. So we're going to see some applications of this, some comparisons. We've got a pretty good one in John and in Numbers and First Nephi, but this little reminder here, in preparing to teach this lesson, take some time to study the context of these accounts to be ready to answer questions students might have. Well, the truth is, students will relate best to examples that they actually know. and understand well. John might be okay. This is the bread of life. Numbers, I'm guessing this would take quite a bit of background to talk about the Israelites and who Joshua and Caleb are, and the promised land and the potential there. And so this one is a great one, but it would take, for that one to do well, it would take a lot of background talk. So this isn't something that you could just have students go do on their own. It would take some effort. We usually can find pretty good success with Nephi compared to Laman and Lemuel, just because our students are so familiar with that. And so that's an option. If I were to choose of these three, this one might be the one I'd go to first, maybe John's second, maybe Numbers third, if you were to do that. But there is at the end a supplementary idea here, and I'll put a link for this. This is an example from church history where Ezra Booth and Edward Partridge were reacting to the land of Zion. This is a Midwestern place. And so I'll put a link to this article in the description below the video. But this one's a little bit easier to read, where we can see Ezra Booth was looking at Zion and struggling, and Edward Partridge was also having the same challenges, but he was working through it and seeking to be faithful. I think it's a good example from church history. You could actually print it out and read it together and just relax with a little story time, but it's a great illustration. That's my third idea. Remember that I might end the lesson with what we started about and talking about how does this relate to increasing our faith in Jesus Christ and our discipleship to him. I think it'll be a great experience. Thanks for teaching, and look forward to great things ahead.